Huh? Okay. Do you need the mic closer up or farther down? Does it matter? Since it's just going through there. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, son. All right, well, we'll go ahead and start. And Jerry will come when he comes, I guess. All right, let's open with prayer. Father, thank you so much for your goodness to us, Lord. Just thank you for your presence with us through this day. Thank you for the strength, Father, to accomplish the things that we needed to do. Pray that you were glorified by all that we said and thought and did today. And we just pray that you're glorified by our time together. We thank you for your word and the truths that it contains, Father. That it is the truth and the standard by which we measure everything else to declare itself to be true. We just thank you for the preservation of it. We thank you that we can seek to understand it in the original, Father, so that we might know you more accurately. Pray that these truths would then change our life, Father, and how we behave. And we just thank you for the freedom we have to spend this time together. And just pray for your Spirit as he leads us through our time. We pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, so I added a little new stuff to this, but not much. I just refined it. So this was from last Wednesday. So I just went and refined it a little bit and cleaned it up. But what I decided to do was, this one is definitely new from what you already have, the second declension. So you can, unless you have notes on the other copy, you can chuck it out and just use this one. And what I decided to do is I'm going to put the date on the bottom so everyone will know the most updated version. That way it's like you know what to keep and what to throw away instead of trying to pick through it all. And really it's the first, like I said, the first couple lessons were going to be the place where most of the change was going to happen. From here on out it should be pretty minimal. One other thing I was thinking about doing is that I might do like an appendix to some of these lessons and use like some of the examples I'll look at tonight from the Greek text. I'll just do sort of an addendum at the end of the lesson and just give these examples.
Just picking apart some things.
Yeah, so I'll cover examples on here, but then what I'm going to do is just give a insert page for the end of the lesson, and I'll just indicate examples of this section, and we don't have to redo everything all over again. And I started doing that with my original grammar, was that every lesson I had a Greek insight, a word, a phrase, verse, something like that, picked something out of it and did that. And then I started just doing it in class, so I removed them from the grammar. There's still some traces of them, I think, in some of them. But I might go back and do that, but just like I say, just do an inserted page at the end, and that'll be it. Yeah. All right, so we're going to go back and review a little bit on morphology and anatomy of words, and then we'll get in a second declension. Basically, whatever's on the screen is just going to be what's in the notes, except for just like the examples I'll give and just walk through the text that way. So that way there isn't anything new that you won't have. So we started looking last time, and this is one of the ways I refined it, was we were talking about moving towards declension. So we went from phonemes moving into morphemes, from phonology into morphology, and so basically just laid out three primary steps. The first one was phonology. We looked at the sounds of the language, which is the alphabet. Now we start combining those phonemes together, and then we start forming the morphemes. And morphemes come in different ways and shapes depending on nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and then for the verbs. And then the third step was inflection, but we'll look at morphology. So morphemes are the smallest, considered the smallest unit of speech that conveys meaning. So when we get down to phoneme, there isn't really any meaning. It helps us to distinguish between one word or the other word, that kind of thing. When we get to morphemes now, we talk about meaning. And like I said before when we looked at this, is that when we get into morphology, now we're going to get into syntax. Because when we start talking about these prefixes, or in the case of nouns, suffixes that we add on to words, that starts telling us relationship of this word to that word, and so on in a sentence. And that's one of the examples that we'll look at, is just looking at how it indicates relationship. So morpheme is the smallest part. There are several ways we can look at it. One is that we have the roots. So in Metzger's book, the triliteral roots, some of them biliteral roots, that's the root. Then comes stem, and then comes the variegated forms, the inflections, whether it's noun, verb, and the changes that we do. So when we talk about morphemes, we have roots, then we also have suffixes and prefixes. Those are all considered morphemes. They all have meaning to them. So when we get to like conjunctions, particles, negative particles, all of that, those are all morphemes. They all have meaning in that, but they won't change like nouns and adjectives will. They pretty much stay unchanged. Like prepositions, they will go with certain cases, but there won't be any changes with the prepositions, except for if you have a preposition that ends in a vowel and it comes before a word that begins with a vowel, it'll drop the vowel at the end. So that's really the major change that happens. So we have roots, and then we have suffixes and prefixes. The root carries the central or core meaning of the word, and then the prefixes and suffixes then add further meaning to that. And we can change then when we're talking about a verb or a noun, we can change some of the prefixes, and it will then change the way the word is used, whether it's a noun or adjective or adverb, and we'll get more into that as we go along. And so as we go, the more of these roots that you pick up and understand, right, the better you'll be. But we'll always try through the grammar to go back to the root meaning of things if we're going to talk about definition of something. Because I think that's really important, because as we go along, there's always going to be this sense of when we need to know what was the root meaning. Prepositions, we'll get to that, but prepositions, when they're in compound, will go back to their root significance. And when they're used just as a standalone word, they have various remote meanings from the original. So an example.
That's when, like, it has one meaning for genitive, one meaning for accusative.
Yeah. And so usually what happens in grammars is that they'll give you that preposition in relation to the case, right? And how it would be used of that case. And so what they end up doing is dropping off like the basic root meaning of that preposition, not realizing that when you come to then compound forms and you put a preposition on the front of a word in a compound form, that preposition will go back to what its root meaning was. And if you want to understand the etymology and all that kind of stuff, then you need to know that. So because you have like pros, right? And most would say it's with, by, kind of thing like that, right? They won't give you the root meaning, which is literally face to face. So then you have occurrences where Paul talks about coming to see you, pros, I want to be with you. And so they would translate it that way, but really he's talking about I want to have that face to face connection with you. Or when we have the word was with God, pros, face to face. John uses it because he wants to show there's distinction of the personages in the triune Godhead, right? Father, Son, and there's this intimacy and fellowship that way. So those cases, it's going to go back to its original. So all of you learn is with, then you sort of have this sterile understanding, which is interesting because Stanley Porter wrote a book on Greek New Testament idioms. If you can find it, get it. It's a little paperback. Stanley Porter on Greek idioms of the New Testament. It's a light blue paperback book. He was a previous student of my father's years and years ago when my dad was teaching at Talbot. But he talks about that, the traditional, with the preposition pros, that traditional translation of with. And he says you miss the dynamic and the reality of what John is saying there and that intimacy of it. And then he does the same thing in 1 John in the early verses. John uses the same preposition as he talks about fellowship with the Father and with the Son. So there is this dynamic element that we miss by falling into what we traditionally would translate it as, right? So just, I'm not the only one who thinks that, right? So if we take an example, sta, and really this is where Greek started with verbs or what have you. It started with the root, it started with the aorist, we would say, and then it built out from that. So if we take sta, we can see the parallel. So I'll do this with English, and you can carry it over into Greek. But we have sta, which means to stand, histemi. So the root of histemi is sta, right? So if we break this down, this was actually systemi. This rough breathing tells me that there was a sigma at the beginning, and because they started dropping sigmas off, they dropped the sigma off the front, but it left a rough breathing, so it's histemi. So if you take this off and this ending off me, then you have sta or sta, which is the root. And so you can then take that root and build whatever you want off of it. You can make it a noun, you can make it an adjective, make it, in this case, a verb. And so that's the flexibility of the Greek, but that's the beauty of these prefixes and suffixes once you start adding them on. So with our English word, stable, it's similar to the Greek, right? It's able to stand, sta able. And so we do the same thing in English. We have to establish, means to make able to stand. The E on the front of this is from Latin, ex, means from, right? And it has the idea of what it imparts. And the ish means to make. So it is to make able to stand alone. So we have the same thing happening in English that we see in Greek. We just don't necessarily learn English this way. And then we don't see the reality of what happens. So establishment then, therefore, means the act or result of making to stand alone. So you add the ment on the end, and now you add another meaning to it. That's another morpheme that has meaning, that we attach it as a suffix in this case, and it adds significance to the sta. Or we can add dis on the front of it, and it negates everything, right? It's the complete undoing of it all. So we have the same reality happening in the English language. So now as we walk through this, right, these are principles that happen in language generally. You'll start picking up on some of these things yourself. But then that's the beauty then when you're teaching someone the word, right? All of these elements have meaning and significance that they bring to that term. Then you get to sit down and unpack it for somebody, right? One person that I really appreciate, although he doesn't do it much with like the original languages, but will do it with English, but he deals with words often, is R.C. Sproul. And he really, he does that quite often in his teaching, is that he'll take a word, even if it's the English word, and he'll break it down and say this is the significance of it. And it just adds so much more depth and understanding and comprehension for us.
Hey, Steve, did you say it was Idioms of the Greek New Testament?
Yes. Yeah.
That's
I think that's
$91
the
on
title.
Amazon.
Yeah, it's not cheap.
Wow. Did I get that right? I just
This is the unfortunate thing, because we used to have that Pilgrim's bookstore, right, by Divine and all that by the what's that mall way down the 205 past the airport.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Pilgrim's was
Yeah.
So Pilgrim's was down that way, and they used to have all these used books and that kind of thing for super cheap. But then the older couple, they didn't want to run anymore, and no one wanted to take it over from them, so they sold it and shut it down, which was really unfortunate. So you can search, and if you find it cheap enough in your price range, just a little paperback.
For $60.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's it.
It's that one there. Yeah,
Can I see that real quick? I'm just,
yeah. This one was $20.
You want to sell it for $20? And what's the advantage? Oh, it talks about.
So he takes it's kind of like with Metzger's work. He just looks at cases, tense, voice, all those kinds of things. But he just looks at some of the unique aspects of all of them and sort of tries to help you get your mind wrapped around the language from the Greek perspective. And he cuts through a lot of the grammatical gibberish that other guys throw at. So he's trying to sort of break away from the westernization of Greek and sort of get back to sort of a
Which many of the
core understanding. Yeah. But if you find it, if I can dig up another one, I'll just give both of you a copy if I can find another one. Then give them to you. Moole has one too. Moole has one that's it's pretty good, but I really like Porter's. It's more up to date, and there's more things that we've learned of the Greek language since. So he has a lot to contribute. Since he was a student of my dad's, he has that sort of flavor to it too. So we looked at phonemes was the smallest part of language. We're just talking about the individual letters, consonants, vowels, diphthongs. And then we move to morphemes. Then when you take those phonemes, put them together, we form morphemes, which then we have meaning. And that led us to the third step, inflectional system. And that's what we're going to look at tonight is nouns and second declension of Koine Greek. And again, I'm going to just basically follow the headings of your notes there. And then I have some examples that we'll look at. And then I'll give you a copy of those later. So looking at the grammatical study then on lesson 2, nouns of second declension. Declension introduced the morphological analysis of nouns. It's a mouthful, but it's really easy. Is really what we're going to get at. But most of the Greek words contain one or more morphemes, right? We saw that. The root morpheme, and then you have the prefix or the suffix morpheme. And that's essentially, when we're looking at Greek words, that's what we're dealing with. We'll expand. We'll start with nouns because they're easier. Verbs, there's a lot more baggage that comes with those. And then participles, it's a combination of verb and noun. And so we'll get to those down the line. But what we'll do is when we get to those points is I'll just give you sort of little keys to look for, and those will unlock all the doors for you. And we'll walk through it together. I'm going to try and get a whiteboard because I want to be able to write stuff up here while we're going through there. So these morphemes then are referred to as inflectional morphemes because when you attach them, say you take a morpheme, the root of a word, sta, and you attach the me at the end of it, which causes the vowel to change, stay me. Once you attach that me to the end of sta, you now have changed the meaning, but you've also changed the form of the word, right? An inflection is really all that we're talking about is just a change of the word. We have this in English. And inflections in English, just like Greek, they help define relationship within a sentence. Talk, talked. Put an ed on the end of it. That helps us understand the relation to go, goes. Whether I have that suffix on the end or not depends on its relationship to words around it. So like I say, we're talking about morphology and the anatomy of Greek words, but we're also going to filter into syntax and their relationship with each other. So the main importance with inflectional morphemes could be said that it lies in the level of sentence structure and sentence meaning, right? It tells us the relationship of things. So in this, we can look at it and say that this is from Titus 1:1, right? So we can look at Paulos, and we know because of the os ending, that morpheme suffix, it's an inflectional morpheme, we know with that os on there that it's nominative case. He's the doer. So we could translate it, I, Paul, am writing, or we can wait and put the verb down later when he mentions Timothy, right? Writing to Timothy, but I, Paul, he's doing the action. He's the doer of it. Then the doulos and apostolos tells us that he's defining more fully who he is, right? And when we look at that, one, they share the same ending, which tells us something about nouns and adjectives. They need to share the same endings. But also, it tells us that they have the same ending, but they function differently, right? One is the subject. The others are describers of the subject, right? Defining him, okay? And so it's interesting. So I got a text from a brother pastor down south, and he was asking me, there's a friend who's a missionary, and he had taken all these classes in seminary, but one of the things he hadn't taken yet was how to compose an outline for a sermon and to preach it. And he has to preach in Thailand coming up soon in the church there. And so he's like, how do I, put together an outline? Well, this is part of how you do that. Understanding the grammatical relationships, right? That will filter into how you develop your outline from that. But basically, then these inflectional morphemes, they help tell us the relationship of, and then when you get to Jesu Christu, and we have the genitive ending on there, then that also then takes us to another level of relationship, right, between those words and what precedes.
Can you go back for a minute?
Yeah.
Is the Apollos doulos, so it's the stem Paul, then duels. So how do I
Which,
guess
this
I
one
get
here?
lost on the stem and what's the stem
For
and
for
what's
doulos, most of the time what you're going to encounter is the stem. The root is like the original. So doulos, that omicron upsilon, right? We said that a and u are by compensation or contraction. So there was a change here. And the triliteral root for doulos is deo. It is to bind, right? And so that's the triliteral root. That one's a little bit more trickier than, say, like sta or da to give or tha to put or place. But those ones you'll learn some of these ones as you go along, right? But that's the stem, we would call this without the os at the ending. The dual, we would say that's a stem.
okay, that's right.
Yeah. Then when you go back to deo, that's the root, because you can't take any further back than that. So basically a root is a morpheme, which is the smallest unit of meaning in a language, and you can't go any further back than that. So like our English word dogs, it's two morphemes, dog and s. If I drop the s off and I have dog, that's the lowest form I can take it back to. That what we call is the root, because you can't reduce it any more than that.
Deo is the root, is that what you said?
For teta,
Yeah.
so this one here, teos, so teo,
Chaos, right.
yeah,
Yeah.
teo. So
Been through this before and I'm still.
so you'll, once you get the other parts down, you figure it out, like doulos or paulos, and we look at paulos, this is the stem, and it really can't, it doesn't go any back further than this as far as we know. Just means little, small, probably from the Latin, because Paul had the name Saul, which is his Jewish name. Paul was his Greco-Roman name, right? Because oftentimes those who were born of Jewish descent in those days would be given two names. Jesus also called Justus, right? Colossians. So he had two names, Paul and Saul. Paul when he was with the Greeks out in the marketplace, Saul when he was, right, rabbinical school and in the temple and all of that, right? And so they would bear two names, and Paul is likely from Latin, meaning little. So some of these you can reduce back, like doulos to triliteral root. Some it's hard to figure out which it is and how far back it goes. Some, you, like with paulos, you just run into the stem. Apostolos, this is your preposition, so you drop that off. And this is from stello, which take it back to its triliteral root is stel. It's as far back as that one will go.
So that's, so it's, the STO is the stem. Everything else is telling us what that word means.
Yeah. So this is an addition to it. This is an addition to it. This is, so this, its root actually has an epsilon here. And so what they do is they change this to an omicron because they want to make it a noun instead of a verb.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this is a verbal noun, which is nice because then it helps us to understand how we take Jesu Christu. Because it's a verbal noun implying action, a sent one,
That's
sent
the verb,
off, right? So who did the sending off? Jesus Christ. So then, yeah, and then that tells you then, how do I take this genitive? Possessive genitive, apostle who belongs to Christ, or in this case, subjective genitive, he's the one who sent him as an ambassador. So the paulos, doulos, apostolos, that's the easy layer. And then the other layers that come, right? The other words around it. But it is these inflectional morphemes, the things that we add on the end, the os, the u, that help give meaning as far as relationship to the other words in there.
So the subject or the noun and the adjective that goes with it, they need to share the same case.
which is really helpful. Because I'll give you an example. So this is from 2 Timothy 1, 8 and 9. Okay? So Paul tells Timothy not to be ashamed of the gospel, but to fellowship in the suffering. So pathe is from pat, to suffer. Kaka, bad stuff. This is your preposition soon, right? Which is a new. But because you put new next to a kappa, regressive assimilation, it causes this to change and it becomes a guttural nasal. Sung, right? And so we drop this off. This is together with, this is evil, this is suffer. So suffer evil together with me for the gospel. Euangelio kata, according to the dunamen of Teu. Now this is cool because then we look at this and we see this. We know that everything that's going to follow here is connected to that. And this tells me that.
You pronounce that tattoo? How did you say that?
Teu,
Tat-
right? So it's
I
taha.
always said they.
Yeah. So that's the old traditional westernized way of pronouncing it, right? Th. But it was actually taha. So it was tau plus aspirate. And so essentially that's what it is. And then if you say it rapidly, that ha part, right, fades out. It's like we say the word ghost. There's an H in there, but we don't necessarily hear it, but there's an aspiration there. Well, same for them if they said it rapidly, it would just be tau.
So don't say theo, say teo.
Yeah.
Gotcha, okay.
Because then when you have changes that happen and you'll have a deaspirated form, well, deaspirated form is just a tau, right? Theta is the aspirated version of tau.
I just didn't realize.
Yeah. But that case then, this is the beauty of these inflectional morphemes, is that now they show relationship. Because now they know that when Paul talks about according to the power of God, he's going to say, this is what that power looks like. Who is the one who he saved us and called, right, with a holy calling, not according to the works of us, but, Allah, emphatic but, absolutely not according, right, or absolutely according to his own purpose and Karen grace. So all of this is defining and helping to understand the power of God. If I summed it up, it would be this, that you are to suffer hardship according to the power of God, who is able to do what no man can do for himself. And there's all of these other chiastic structures and all that kind of stuff in there, which are really cool. But so that's the beauty, though, of getting into then cases, right? Genitive, ablative, all that kind of thing. The form shows you relationship, and then you figure out how is this used. Is it a genitive? Is it ablative? Or if you have dative, locative, instrumental, they all share the same form, but they all have different meaning. Yeah. So this is where, like I say, this is where then syntax comes in. This one is cool. This is 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. Paul says, so Paulos, right, to the church, te ecclesia, to Theou of God, right, writing to Corinth. So to Theou is a possessive genitive, the church that belongs to God. And therefore, then, it doesn't belong to any individual. So he goes down, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, right? How we exalt men. And there's a lot that we do, but we just don't realize we do this. So this is what he's going to do. So this is interesting because it'll take you further. With that genitive, possessive genitive, it's God's church. Then when he gets to the prayer section in verses 4 through 9, all of these verbs are passive. Starting in verse 4. He has given, talking about God. He has enriched. This is all passive. Theta, eta. The. He has confirmed. Passive. Did it to us. He confirmed us. Confirmed the gospel in us. And he will confirm us in the end, future. Some might call that assurance. So he starts with that possessive genitive. That's the statement of fact. It is God's church. And then when he moves into the prayer section, he thanks God for what he has given, how he has enriched, that he has confirmed, and that he will confirm us. And then verse 9, if you look in that text, and emphatically at the front, faithful God is, who has then called us. And he goes back to past. So the fact that we will be confirmed in the future is all about God's faithfulness. So this is from Sunday. I know I ruffled some feathers from some folks. But you can only say what's there. I don't have any freedom to do anything other than that, right? And it's not the only place where we have this assurance about God will do. There's no mention in here at all of what we do at all. It's just God. Same with the end of Jude. All those statements aren't, I read one author who was talking about, he will keep you from falling if you are willing. But there's no if clause. There's no when clause. There's no as long as you do this, he will do this clause. It's just a statement, this is what God's going to do. Do we then get called to persevere, right? Yes. Both are true. We want to harmonize them. It's just there, right? So you run across these kinds of statements. So this is the beauty of going back to that. So knowing in that case that possessive genitive, then that unfolds and leads you to the verbs that come, all passive voice. This is what happens to you. Which is really amazing because when you think about the sinfulness in the church of Corinth, right, that Paul would be thankful about these things. But again, he's focusing on what God's done, not what they've done. So that's the beauty of these inflections. And going back to the notes that on second declension is that they then show relationship to words within a sentence, within a paragraph. If you look at John chapter 1, the Gospel of John, you have ha logos in verse 1. You don't have ha logos mentioned again until verse 14. There's a connection. John makes that for us. You have a play on the verbs then because he has ha logos in verse 1, ha logos in verse 14. He returns back to his thought from verse 1. In verse 1, he talks about who was, right, was before and so on, was with God, was God. Then you come down to verse 14, and he talks about he became. So he who was became flesh. He was face to face with God, tabernacled with us. And he just makes that connection for us. The cases do that for us. They help us see these relationships. So in a lot of ways, knowing the original expedites your understanding of a passage much more quickly in a lot of ways. There are other complexities you have to wrestle with, but. So we looked at inflection then. Inflection is basically, it's the change in the form, whether it's nouns, pronouns, verbs. Inflection is just changed. If you run across this in a grammar, that's really what they're talking about. This is change in the form. So as we saw previously, then this inflection can be subdivided into declined and conjugated. So when we talk about declension, we're talking about nouns, adjectives, pronouns, and so on. We talk about conjugated. This is inflection, the change of form. When we're talking about verbs, it's conjugated. And so we'll get to that. And that'll be lesson 3 or 4. We'll get into verbs. You start putting these things together. And then uninflected words, on the other hand, consist only in single morphemes. So conjunctions, kai, gar, prepositions, and pra, and we have adverbs, nun and palin. Those don't go through any change other than, like I said, if you have a preposition that comes before a word with a vowel, it'll drop a vowel if it ends in it.
This is kind of an aside, but on Sunday, you point out the word de at the end, and you rendered it now. Like in Metzger's it said and but, which I'm still confused about how it can be and but. But you're also saying that it can be now?
That can be now.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's confusing.
In one sense, it's now can be confusing. but he's not making a contrast there necessarily. Jude isn't when he used it, right? So I can't go there with it. You can use it in the sense of now, where he's either temporal or he's making a pause, focusing attention. And in that case, that's what he's doing there, because there's no temporal element that would be reflected that. And normally, if he wanted to do now temporally, he would use the adverb nun. That's generally more of what you would use. Yeah. So something in that case, you can have, a lot of times you find it but, like Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4, right? We were dead in our trespasses and sins, but God. We have de. There's a clear contrast between what we once were to what we are now. So the context will bear that out. Jude wasn't making any kind of contrast. He was just moving into a doxology. So he's sort of like an isolated unit. So I know at least he's not contrast, it's not but. It is an and, because he's not carrying on previous thoughts either, right? Because that would be conjunction. Usually if they do that, it would be kai, is normally what's used that way.
When would you use kai over de to express and?
Well, like when Paul talks about the fact that I'm see what I'm thinking of. If you want to combine two terms, like righteousness and godliness, something like that, then you would use kai. It's just a connective. And you're stringing together a series of things. If you have a series of adjectives, right, adverbs, that kind of thing, you use kai to link them all together. What's that song we still hear when we were kids? At least I did. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Hooking up phrases and clauses and so on. That's basically kai. So if you have a long string of things, and, then you would, that's what you would use kai for. So you have that in Ephesians chapter 2, the first verse. He talks about the fact, and you, what? I'm positive that's a Ephesians 2:1. Kai humas, and you. So that tells us that he's continuing the thought from chapter 1 at the end there. He talks about the power of God. So he talks about the power of God in the end of chapter 1 of Ephesians, how that power of God raised Christ from the dead, seated him in the heavenly places, right, and so on. Then he goes back in verse 1 of chapter 2, and you also. So now he's showing another example of that power of God. You also were dead spiritually in your trespasses and sins. And then he takes the same verbs, you were raised, you were seated together with, and he uses them again to talk about us. So really he is giving two examples of the power of God in the end of chapter 1, the beginning of chapter 2, and then ultimately in the second part of chapter 2. That and kai connects chapter 1 and 2 together. That tells me that he's continuing his thought about the power of God. It's not starting a completely brand new section standing by itself.
So he didn't do that in Jude then?
Yeah, no.
It's not, you actually can see it, it's not even there.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good contrast to see. One of those two.
So generally de is used in the sense of but. Can be and, but it's rare. Most of the time kai is going to be used for and if you're connecting thoughts. So de has that way of now, it's just stopping you. Like I said, doxology is a pause. So that now halts us, and he's going to pause and talk about God.
So it really, the way I wrote it out here, to him now,
Yeah,
be able to keep.
yeah,
To him now. So Kai wouldn't even fit in that sentence at all.
yeah, yeah.
When you look at it, it's to him now.
And because the earlier verses were talking about things that we're supposed to do. So God's not mentioned in that part. And then he isolates it and says, okay, now, getting back to God and what he does, he carries it on.
So it's like an and, but I'll look at your examples.
But is the
usually
usual, yes. There's two words for but in Greek, de and Allah. Allah is emphatic. De by itself is not emphatic, it's just making a contrast, right? It can be emphatic in the case of Ephesians. You're dead in your trespasses and sins, right? But the context bears this out. But God was merciful, right? So, but is the key in the normal root significance of de. But it can have a softened element. There's no contrast in Jude. It's more of now, right? I'm changing thought. I want you to pause, right? And I'm going to focus on this is who God is.
Which gets back to context.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
What's the context, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
what's driving it. That's the difference.
Yeah.
That's what's
And
driving
then in Jude, when he talks about his power and authority, majesty, right, in the past and now, noon. Not de, but noon, now and then. So that de isn't a temporal term when we render it now. In that case, it's meant to capture our attention and get us to focus on God. It's just a pause. Because he's had this long string of, okay, these are the apostates. Then he comes back to this is what you do. Now, back to God, because he started with God in verse 1. Now we're back to God again. What does he do? And then he focuses on that.
Yeah, I think I recall in Ephesians, that section in the King James, it's rendered but now.
Yeah.
But now.
And then you can connect de and kai together and they can be used in tandem, but that's for another day. It's another day.
It keeps going.
But that's going back to the thing with Greek, right? You begin with this root and you can add suffixes, prefixes, and you add meaning, and you can be so precise, right? When he talks about Jude, katanopion, 3 words, right? To look down in. And what does he see? Blamelessness, right? So we can take a simple root and and then we can do prepositions on the front, and we can build up these, right? And so that's the beauty of the language, precision. You can have de kai, te de, te kai. We can have all these combinations, right, to get right exactly what we want to say. So there's no mistaking. Yeah. But with all of these conjunctions, prepositions, adverbs, and all that, they don't change their form like the other morphemes. They basically just have their meaning. And knowing that root meaning is good. All right, so this leads us to declension. How much time we got? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, because I want to get into how the cases function. We'll end with that. So declension, then, generally speaking, from your notes there, is generally speaking, nouns, adjectives, pronouns, articles indicate their case, number by inflectional endings. And it's really the primary focus, case and number. Number is singular or plural, right? We can throw in there gender, but we'll just leave that aside for the sake of simplicity. But when we're dealing with nouns, adjectives, pronouns, and the articles and that, we're focusing on case and number primarily. So to decline then, when we make changes to adjectives, nouns, including participles and pronouns, we are said to decline them. Declining then is a verb used to describe the act of changing adjectives and nouns. So I only introduce this to you because, like I say, if you go on to other grammars to expand your understanding of Greek and so on, they'll use these terms, and so it's good to know what we're talking about, right? But I'll just keep going back to the basic morphemes and inflection and try to keep it as simple as possible. But they describe then the act of changing adjectives and nouns. So example, house is singular, houses is plural. We use English and we don't often think about really what we're saying. Sometimes, because it's our native tongue, we just do it automatically. And we don't necessarily sit down and analyze what we're saying until we read something, right? And I think that this is what hangs people up sometimes when they come to the Bible. Because they're not used to thinking with observation and critically. Breaking words down is a preposition. What's the significance of a preposition? What's the significance of this preposition? In as opposed to by, with, right? We're normally not used to breaking down our speech that way, and a lot of conversations we have is just automatic, right? Words that we've used, we have our own slang, we have slang at work, we have slang, right? Whatever activities in play, if it's sports, whatever, everyone has their own vocabulary. And we get so used to using it that sometimes we don't stop and break it down and think about it. And schools these days don't teach grammar like they used to. They just don't do it anymore. And I really, my personal opinion is, that's Satan. The more he can dummy us down. So you have all of these translations that aren't really translations, they're dynamic equivalents, but they are so overly simplified, you miss so much of the accuracy and the truth that God communicates in his word, which some of these translations, if you lean on them, they're incorrect. It's like the Latin Vulgate. The Roman Catholic Church had a misunderstanding about Mary and her role because of the translation from Greek into Latin. Had they been able to go back to the original on their own, they would have figured out that's not it, right? So, some of these things we don't think about, so we just sort of have to train ourselves to do that and think about these things, but number matters. Singular or plural is going to make a difference. So declension is the inflection of substantives or nouns, adjectives, pronouns. Conjugation is the inflection then of verbs. And in declension, adjectives, pronouns, articles, and participles follow the analogy of nouns. So principles that we learn now will be carried over to adjectives and so on. And even when we get to third declension and first declension, all that kind of stuff, a lot of these principles just carry over to those as well. So same thing, like if you have adjectives, Paulos, doulos, apostolos, they have to fit with Paulos. Same for third and first declension nouns. So there are three declensions in Koine Greek, three systems of inflecting Greek nouns. First declension is characterized by stems ending in the vowel alpha. Second declension by stems ending in omicron, and then third declension by stems ending in consonants. Third declension is done last because it's the trickiest, but once we get there, it's not going to be so tough. The second is the easiest, and it's also the most frequent. So example, Paulos, doulos, apostolos, all those are second declension. And we find a vast majority of them in the New Testament. The others are not as frequent. So that's usually why we start with second declension. So declension explained then, as seen above, declension introduced. Declension is the inflection of substantive for the purpose of indicating its relation to the rest of the sentence. So now we're going to dissect this a little bit further. Declension has to do with form, case has to do with function. For defining terms, right? So when we talk about declension, we're focusing on the form, the inflection, the change in that form. Right? So we have the ending oo. Okay? That ending is shared, the form is shared by a genitive and an ablative, if you look at your notes there, right? So I give you an example of, on top of page 2 for second declension, omicron endings, right? So you can have oo, can be used for a genitive or an ablative. The oo, the form, is what we call declension. The case is how it's used. Is this oo reflecting a genitive or ablative in the context, right? Is where you're going to figure that out. So we're just taking our terms and, right, define them a little bit more. So in parsing nouns then, when we look at a noun in context, there are 4 things we're looking for. Declension, that's the form. So does it have an os ending? Does it have an oo ending? Does it have an o ending? Does it have an on ending? Or is there an vocative? Vocative is the case of address. So Luke, most excellent Theophilus, that's an address, that's vocative. And that is a true vocative. You won't find very many vocatives in the New Testament. So declension is the form, case is the function, nominative, ablative, dative, locative, instrumental, gender, masculine, feminine, neuter, and then number, singular or plural. So when we look at nouns in the Greek, this is what we're looking at. Declension, the form, case, how that form is used in the context, gender, masculine, feminine, or neuter, and number. Is it singular or is it plural?
I noticed with the first declension, there's no vocative for the feminine. Is that just because it's not found in the New Testament?
Yeah. So declension then is a matter of inflected form. It has no particular function significance. The other three have to do with the function of the word. So declension is just the form. Then we talk about case, right? Number, gender, and all that. Now we're talking about how does it work and what's its function. I know it seems like we're splitting hairs, but like I say, you're going to get into the weeds, and it's good to know how these things are distinguished and what does it matter. Because when we get to the text, right, I mean, that's really it. Every letter, every accent matters, right? It's like that quote from Buddha. If he would have capitalized the second H in he would have been accurate. So case explained then. This is moving into how then these are used, these forms. So case has to do with the function of the noun as it relates to the verb or other parts of the sentence. In Greek, there are 4 inflected forms, 5 if one counts the vocative. There are 4 forms, declensions, right? As, u, o, on, right? E if we have vocative. Plural masculine, oi, on, ois, us, oi, right? And then we have the neuter, singular and plural. You have 4 forms, but you have 8 distinct case functions. That makes sense? So some early grammars, beginning grammars, they used to talk about there's only 4 forms, and then you would only learn nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative, and vocative occasionally. And that's all you'd learn. But the problem is that as you then started interacting with the Greek text, you realized that these forms were used differently. And they weren't just limited to nominative, genitive, dative. They found that there's a locative element to it, right? Location. Or there's an instrumental element to it, by means of, right? And so they started realizing, well, there's these forms, 4 of them, but there's actually 8 ways in which these forms can be used. And this is good for us to understand because then we get into prepositions. Well, with the dative, locative, and instrumental, the O ending, we notice that there's an iota there. That's a little clue that'll help you discern the dative, locative, and instrumental form. But then we get to the preposition N, in. So preposition N, in, goes with dative, locative, and instrumental. More accurately with the locative, right? Because it's indicating location. So understanding the function of the cases helps you understand why prepositions are used with certain cases, right? So getting this down, then we move to prepositions. The connection of relationship becomes very simple. We'll just keep adding on all these blocks. So the following chart then indicates the forms, the case function, and then the basic idea of the case function. So I give you an example on top of page 3. We just take anthropos and do it masculine singular, masculine plural, so you get an idea of how these things function together. But let's go down to the bottom of page 3, and you'll see that the diagram there. We have form, and then we have case, the case function, and then we have the basic idea of the case. So with the form as, the plural oi, that's the nominative case, that's the function, and then the basic idea is designation. And it is the doer of the action. Now I give you on page 4, I give you separate cases, more fully developed, and I explain those so you can read those on your own later. And I just walk through the different cases and give you some examples of how they're used. But always have these general ideas in mind. So going back to the bottom of page 3 there, then the form ou, plural, on, can be either genitive or an ablative in case function. Genitive describes, ablative separates. So we will often have the ablative case used with the preposition apa, off and away from, showing separation. Right? The next on top of page 4 there, number 3, we have the form o or ois, plural. That can be used for a dative, locative, or instrumental. Dative is interest. Locative is location or position. And then instrumental is means. And again, know these basic definitions because you're going to always go back to these. And I would say this before we get to prepositions and all that, start with the basic significance of them, the basic meaning, and then work out from that. If there's more elaborated from this in the context, let the context tell you that. But just start with the root meaning and then work out from the root meaning. Start with any root idea of something and work out from that, and let the text then develop it further for you. And that way then that's the safest route in doing exegesis, is just to begin with the basic and then work out from there. If there's an elaboration, something more to it, something fuller context, we'll let you know. So then 4 and 5 there, we have 4 is on, us, plural. Now, I wish I could do this. So the article for us, plural, is tous, right? If you look on page 2, I give you the articles for those. So if you go down to the accusative, us ending, the article in brackets there is tous. Okay? So you see the omicron upsilon, what does that tell us? Compensation or a contraction, right? Because those aren't, us and ace are not, a are not true diphthongs. They're formed by compensation and contraction. So something happened here. So originally, the article for the accusative was tons, tau, omicron, nu, sigma. Liquids and sigmas don't go together. The nu drops out, compensatory lengthening, the omicron becomes an u. And that's where we get the tous. So even in the articles and the endings, the principle we learned with the alphabet, right, as far as liquids and sigmas and all that, and the compensation contraction, you're just going to keep coming across that as we keep moving on in different things. I don't bear that out in the notes. Maybe I might add it just a little asterisk and explain it, but you guys will know that at least. So accusative case then, on top of page 4, number 4 there, on, singular, plural ending is us. It's the accusative, it is limitation. So you're going to have at times a dative and an accusative. Indirect object, direct object. Or like I was talking about this last Sunday, there's a double accusative. That he will keep you and he will keep you from falling or unfallen. It's a double accusative, and the first one is usually personal, and then the second one adds some significance to that first one. Sometimes we will get that with the name, with Christ, if there is a designation, who is Lord, and we'll get that. But the more I study the New Testament in Greek, the more I find these double accusatives all over the place, and they're really significant. And then 5 there, or oi, which oi is the nominative plural ending, right? So you will have sometimes this address, but you will find the oi ending. But there's very few vocatives. So some grammars don't even give you the vocative ending at all. I just did it so you have it. Like I say, because, I mean, one true example is most excellent Theophilus and Luke. That's really the only time. The other times we have...
The singular is used.
Yeah, and that it's a true vocative case. Where, like when you have letters written, well, then you have dative case. I, Paul, to Titus, right? You wouldn't use a vocative there, even though you're addressing somebody, because it's a letter. Because Luke is writing a formal document to Theophilus himself to help him understand the things that he has learned are the truth, then he is addressing him directly. I'm writing this to you, most excellent Theophilus. So we have that in Luke and Acts is the only place we have a true vocative like that.
So when Christ says scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, that was the dative?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But watch, you may get an evocative pop up in certain situations, but it's really, really rare. Most of the time it's just going to be dative, right? Because it's just who's doing the talking, who's the recipient, right? And dative is the case of interest, right? And it can be a personal or a negative interest. So I'll leave you to go through page 4 there, the separate cases developed. Like I say, I just give a brief description, nominative, case of designation, it's the naming case. Genitive, case of description. So genitive, it'll be used a lot as there is descriptions being given. Actions, so on. Genitive case will be used a lot because it defines and it describes. So we find it in the case, right? When Paul wants to elaborate, I'm a doulos of Teu, God, or I'm apostolos of Jesu Christu, Jesus Christ. So genitive is going to be used to add on further description of things. Hebrew does the same thing because Hebrew actually doesn't have that many adjectives. So what it'll use is a lot of forms in the genitive to give description, and they function like an adjective. So once you then get these, and like I say, the description of these separate cases is just the basic, okay? Once we get into the text, then you're going to have to wrestle with, it's a genitive, but what kind of genitive is it, okay? So I give an example, Philippians 3:8, where Paul is going to talk about the knowledge of Christ Jesus. And he's going to string together, they're all genitives. Teis gnoseos, Christu Jesu, tu kuriou, mu. They're all genitives, but they're all different kinds of genitives. But he piles them on because he's showing this intense emotion. And he's going to talk about the huperikon, it's the surpassing value of knowing Christ. Huper, where we get super from the Latin, super duper, right? It's the super duper value of knowing Christ. So he piles up these genitives. So the first one is genitive of apposition. It is the surpassing greatness is the knowledge of Christ. Genitive apposition is important. So Paul talks about in 2 Timothy chapter 4, receiving the crown of righteousness. It's not an actual crown. It's a genitive apposition. It's the crown that consists of righteousness. So righteousness is the crown. Same with the crown of life. It's a genitive apposition. It's the crown that consists of life. So according to those passages, we're not going to be walking around with little tinsel things on our head. It's actually, right, characteristic. Then you have Christu Jesu. This is an objective genitive. And this is when the noun and genitive receives the action. So it's the knowing of Christ. Right? So you can have a genitive of possession, genitive of, right, subjective genitive, or in this case, objective genitive. So Paul's speaking about the act of knowing the person of Christ, having a personal relationship with him, and not just knowing facts about him. So all of these layers he just piles up, but they're all genitives. And then it's figuring out, well, how is this genitive used? So then we know the statement about knowing, this is used with a personal object, as it is here. It refers to knowing by relationship and experience. So all of these then are morphemes attached to other morphemes to show relationship and then to give meaning. And then the last one, tu kuriou, That's, if you will, a genitive apposition, title of Christ, and then mu is possessive, my, right? My Lord. Which is always interesting. If you look in New Testament, it's almost always the Lord of me, the Lord of us, right? Our Lord, and then Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ. In other words, this is a statement, a confession of faith. And we always find this personal pronoun or in genitive, looking back to the lordship, right? The lordship of. We receive him as Savior, right? Jesu Christu, but we also receive him as Lord. But confessional statements are almost always in relation to Lord. Find that interesting. Anyway, so that is the case. So, like I say, get the basics of the cases down, what the significance of them are, and then, like I say, context will expand the meaning and so on. So next time we'll come back and we'll look at, introduce us to adjectives. And we'll talk about adjectives. But at the end there in the vocabulary, I just give you some of the most basic nouns, and the article follows, and then basic definition of, just so you get a... And I think that what I might do is actually, I might start adding on to some of these lessons, some of the roots, and then the resultant meanings of. I think in the long run that will be beneficial. Any questions? Approaching? Objections?
That would be really
Contentions?
cool to have, at least like with each lexical study, one of the words broken apart into the root and kind of shown the compensatory lengthening, like tying back to that first lesson.
Okay.
With each
Yeah.
lesson. You see how that? Like,
Yeah.
this is why we learn this. You can see it happening each week.
Good.
So show you a million ideas.
I'll write that down. Make a note of it. Yeah, definitely. If you think of things like that, let me know so I can. Because I like I say, I try to plan and think stuff, but then things just sort of come off the cuff too. So if there's something I do off the cuff, you go, hey, that's really good, and it's not in here, then just let me.
Is there a book you can get that